The purpose of a safety gap in a magneto is to protect the high voltage winding from damage. In a high-tension ignition system, the current in the magneto's secondary winding is induced when the primary circuit is interrupted. When the primary circuit is interrupted, the magnetic field around the secondary windings collapse and reverse polarity, which induces a current to flow in the secondary circuit. Capacitance after firing in most modern spark plugs is reduced by the use of a built-in resistor in each plug. The ignition lead acts as a capacitor, which will allow the spark to occur several times during each firing of the plug. By using the resistor in the spark plug, the original spark is the only one allowed to jump the spark plug gap. As an aircraft engine's speed is increased, the voltage induced in the primary coil of the magneto increases. This quality is important to the operation of a magneto. As the cylinder pressures increases with higher engine speed, the magneto's output, primary voltage output, also increases. When the switch is off in a battery ignition system, the primary circuit is opened. It is important to remember that this is a battery ignition system. When the switch is off, the primary circuit is open. In an aircraft ignition system, one of the functions of the capacitor is to facilitate a more rapid collapse of the magnetic field in the primary coil. The capacitor gives the voltage somewhere to go as the points open, which helps facilitate a rapid collapse of the magnetic field. When a shower of sparks ignition system is activated at an engine start, a spark plug fires only while both the retard and advanced breaker points are open. The advanced breaker points open, but the current is grounded through the retard points. When the engine turns to the top dead center, the retard points open. A current flows through the primary windings of the coil and the spark plug fires multiple times. What is the radial location of the two north poles of a 4-pole rotating magnet in a high-tension magneto? 180 degrees apart. The north poles are 180 degrees apart in a 4-pole magneto rotor. How many secondary coils are required in a low-tension ignition system of an 18-cylinder engine? 36. Since each spark plug requires a secondary coil and there are 2 spark plugs per cylinder, then 18 times 2 equals 36. Why do turbine engine ignition systems require high energy? To ignite the fuel under conditions of high altitude and low temperature. What is the relationship between distributor and crankshaft speed of aircraft reciprocating engines? The distributor turns at 1/2 crankshaft speed. Since the engine requires 2 revolutions to fire the cylinders, the distributor must turn 1/2 crankshaft speed. Which of the following are distinct circuits of high-tension magneto? Magnetic, primary, and secondary. Which of the following are advantages of dual ignition in aircraft engines? Gives a more complete and quick combustion of the fuel, provides a backup magneto system, and increases the output power of the engine. If the ground wire of a magneto is disconnected at the ignition switch, the result will be the engine will not stop running when the ignition switch is turned off. This, in effect, turns the magneto on, and it cannot be turned off by the ignition switch. Ignition check during engine run-up indicates a slow drop in RPM. This is usually caused by incorrect ignition timing or valve adjustment. What is the approximate position of the rotating magnet in a high-tension magneto when the points first close? Full register. The full register position is when the rotating magnet is aligned with the pole shoes and maximum flux flow. This causes the maximum current flow in the primary circuit as the breaker points are closed. What component of a dual magneto is shared by both ignition systems? Rotating magnet. Dual magnetos, two ignition systems in one housing, share the same rotating magnet. Using a cold spark plug in a high compression aircraft engine would probably result in normal operation. If new breaker points are installed in a magneto on an engine, it will be necessary to time the magneto internally and the magneto to the engine. Spark plug heat range is determined by its ability to transfer heat to the cylinder head. Upon inspection of the spark plugs in an aircraft engine, the plugs were found caked with a heavy black soot. This indicates a rich mixture. Heavy black soot on spark plugs is a sure sign of cylinder operating at too rich of a mixture. Which of the following would be cause for rejection of a spark plug? Insulator tip cracked. A spark plug is fouled when its spark grounds without jumping electrodes. The definition of a fouled plug is when the spark plug no longer arcs across the electrodes. This condition does not provide any spark to the cylinder. Defective spark plugs will cause the engine to run rough at all speeds. Since the spark plugs are responsible for the operation of the engine, defective plugs would affect the engine at all speeds. When performing a magneto ground check on an engine, correct operation is indicated by a slight drop in RPM. During a ground check, the magnetos are switched off one at a time. This should give a slight drop in RPM since the cylinder is operating on only one spark plug during this check. A safety feature usually employed in pneumatic starters that is used to prevent the starter from reaching burst speed if inlet air does not terminate on schedule is the stator nozzle design that chokes airflow and stabilizes turbine wheel speed. A safety feature usually employed in pneumatic starters that is used if the clutch does not release from the engine drive at the proper time during start is the drive shaft shear point. If a clutch does not release and the engine starts driving, the shear point in the drive shaft will shear, preventing damage and catastrophic failure of the starter. Inspection of pneumatic starters by maintenance technicians usually includes checking the oil level and magnetic drain plug condition. A clicking sound heard at engine coast down in a pneumatic starter incorporating a sprag clutch ratchet assembly is the indication of the pawls reconnecting and riding on the ratchet gear. The pawls are reconnecting the ratchet gear and dragging on the gear at very low speeds as the centrifugal force on the pawls is lost due to decreasing speed. The primary advantage of pneumatic air turbine starters over comparable electric starters for turbine engines is high power-to-weight ratio. High power-to-weight ratio gives the starters the advantage over electric starters. They also can create much higher horsepower for turning the large turbofan engines. Electric starters that could produce enough horsepower for the large turbofan engine would not be practical because of the size that would be required. When using an electric starter motor, the current flow through it is highest at the start of motor rotation. The initial starting torque requires the highest current draw. As the engine speeds up, the current draw will become less. At what RPM is a reciprocating engine ignition switch check made? The slowest possible RPM. To check if the ignition switch can stop the engine, it is turned off to see if the engine starts to die while at idle RPM. It is then switched back on and the engine is placed at idle cutoff. Refer to Figure 2-8-1. When an external power source is connected to the aircraft, the battery cannot be connected to the bus. Generally, the aircraft is powered by only one power source. Onboard generators, the engines, the APU generator, or external power can power the aircraft electrically. If external power is available and selected, other power sources would be dropped offline. Refer to Figure 2-8-1. The type of system depicted is capable of operating with either battery or external power. The secondary coil of a magneto is grounded through the primary coil. The primary and secondary grounds are wired together into the ground of the coil, which is grounded through the case of a magneto. When using an electric starter motor, current usage is highest at the start of the motor rotation. Which of the following breaker point characteristics is associated with a faulty capacitor? Coarse-grained. A faulty capacitor normally causes the points to burn and pit, giving a coarse-grained and sooty appearance. What likely effect would a cracked distributor rotor have on a magneto? Ground the secondary circuit through the crack. When removing a shielded spark plug, which of the following is most likely to be damaged? The core insulator. What will be the effect if a spark plugs are gapped too wide? Hard starting. The wide spark plug gap will require a higher voltage to produce the spark across the plug gap. Since the magneto is turning very slowly during the start, extra voltage would be needed to grab the spark plug gap. Anything that decreases the ability of the engine to provide spark across the plug gap will make the engine harder to start. A certain 9-cylinder radial engine used a non-compensated single-unit dual-type magneto with a 4-pole rotating magnet and separately mounted distributors. Which of the following will have the lowest RPM at any given engine speed? The distributors. Since all the cylinders must be fired in 2 turns of the crankshaft, the distributors will turn 1.125 times crankshaft speed. The speed of the magneto with a non-compensated cam is found by dividing the numbers of cylinders by twice the number of poles. 9 divided by 8 equals 1.125. The distributors will turn at the lowest speed. In a low-tension ignition system, spark plug requires an individual secondary coil. There is a coil for each spark plug which contains a primary and secondary winding or coil. The capacitor-type ignition system is used almost universally on turbine engines primarily because its high voltage and high heat intensity. High heat intensity is very important to provide the type of spark needed for turbine engines. This will assist in the ability of the engine to ignite the fuel during start. The amount of voltage generated in any magneto secondary coil is determined by the number of windings and by the rate of collapse of the magnetic field around the primary coil. If it is found that the shielded ignition system does not adequately reduce ignition noise, it may be necessary to install a filter between the magneto and magneto switch. The ignition noise can be further reduced by adding a filter to help dampen out ignition noise. When using a timing light to time a magneto to an aircraft engine, the magneto switch should be placed in both position. By turning the magnetos to the on both position, the magneto timing and the synchronization to each other can be checked. It is very important to turn the magneto switch off after checking the timing. With the magneto switch in the off position, the magnetos cannot be checked for timing unless the P leads are removed. Aircraft magneto housings are usually ventilated in order to provide cooling and remove corrosive gases produced by normal arcing. Magnetos require ventilation to vent corrosive gases that occur during normal operation of the magneto. The purpose of staggered ignition is to compensate for diluted fuel-air mixture around exhaust valve. In some older type engines, staggered ignition is needed because of the dual diluted fuel-air mixture in the area of the exhaust valve. Most modern engines have both magnetos fire at the same time. What is the purpose of using an impulse coupling with a magneto? To produce a momentarily high rotational speed of the magneto. Since the voltage generated from the magneto depends directly on the speed it is turned, then the increase in rotational speed helps the magneto generate a higher voltage spark. This helps the engine start much easier. The spark is produced in a magneto ignition system when the breaker points are beginning to open. As the points begin to open, the current in the primary field stops flowing and the magnetic field collapses through the secondary windings in the coil, inducing a high voltage in the secondary. In a turbine engine, DC capacitor discharge ignition system, where are the high voltage pulses formed? At the triggering transformer. High voltage is produced in the triggering transformer. What is the purpose of a safety gap in some magnetos? To discharge the secondary coil's voltage if an open occurs in the secondary circuit. The safety gap is used to prevent the secondary coil from being subjected to high voltage if there is no place for the high energy to go to ground. Open in the secondary circuit. In a high-tension ignition system, a primary capacitor of too low a capacity will cause the breaker contacts to burn. Low capacity in the primary capacitor will cause the points to burn because it will not accept the energy, the current flow in primary, when the points open. A defective primary capacitor in a magneto is indicated by burned and pitted breaker points. Which of the following statements regarding magneto switch circuits is not true? In the both position, the right and left magneto circuits are grounded. That's false. In the both position, both switch circuits are open, which places both magnetos in the on position. Hot spark plugs are generally used in an aircraft power plants with comparatively low operating temperatures. A hot plug, heat range, high temperature, is generally used in low compression cylinders which have low operating temperatures. If staggered ignition timing is used, the spark plug nearest the exhaust valve will fire first. The spark plug nearest to the exhaust valve will fire first because of the diluted fuel-air mixture in the area. Dilution will cause the mixture to burn slower. By staggering the ignition timing, the spark plug nearest to the exhaust valve will fire first. A spark plug's heat range is the result of its ability to transfer heat from the firing end of the spark plug to the cylinder's head. When the ignition switch of a single reciprocating engine aircraft is turned to the off position, the primary circuits of both magnetos are grounded. By completing the primary circuit to ground, both magnetos are in the off position. If the primary circuits are open, then the magnetos are in the on position. Thermocouples are usually inserted or installed on the hottest cylinder of the engine. If the cylinder head temperatures are taken from only one cylinder, the hottest cylinder, normally a back cylinder, is used. Which of the following obtained during magneto check at 1700 RPM indicates a short, grounded, circuit between the right magneto primary and the ignition switch? Both at 1700 RPM, the right 0 RPM, left 1700 RPM, off 0 RPM. The right magneto is basically always in the off position in this example. The engine is operating on the left magneto only. If the ignition switch is in the off position, the engine would quit. There would also not be any magneto RPM drop while operating on the left magneto because the RPM was set with the right magneto inoperative. Capacitance after firing of the spark plug is caused by the stored energy in the ignition shielded lead unloading after normal timed ignition. The ignition lead and shielding acts like a capacitor as the spark energy flows through it, which will discharge the energy after the normal spark. This capacitor energy is prevented from jumping the spark plug gap by a resistor installed in the spark plug. Sharp bends should be avoided in ignition leads primarily because weak points may develop in the insulation through which high tension current can leak. Which of the following could cause damage to the nose ceramic or to the electrode of an aircraft spark plug? Improper gapping procedure. If the electrodes are adjusted incorrectly, the nose ceramic insulator can be damaged, rendering the plug inoperative. The electrical circuit from the spark plug back to the magneto is completed by grounding through the engine structure. The engine structure serves as a ground for all the spark plugs. Igniter plugs used in turbine engines are subjected to high-intensity spark discharges, and yet they have a long service life because they do not require continuous operation. Igniters generally only operate during starting of an engine and sometimes at a low intensity during certain flight configurations. They do not operate all the time the engine is running. The flame in the combustor is normally continuous. Generally, when removing a turbine engine igniter plug in order to eliminate the possibility of the technician receiving a lethal shock, the ignition switch is turned off and the igniter lead is disconnected from the plug and the center electrode grounded to the engine after disconnecting the transformer, exciter, input lead, and waiting the prescribed time. What should be used to clean grease or carbon tracks from capacitors or coils that are used in magnetos? Acetone. The constrained gap igniter plug used in some gas turbine engines operates at a closer temperature because the construction is such that the spark occurs beyond the face of the combustion chamber liner. The constrained gap igniter plug does not extend into the combustion chamber. Why are turbine engine igniters less susceptible to fouling than reciprocating engine spark plugs? The high-intensity spark cleans the igniter. The intensity of the spark is hot enough to burn most fouling materials off the electrodes, and the energy used for the spark plugs is much more intense. When a magneto is operating, what is the probable cause for a shift in internal timing? The cam follower and or the breaker point's wear. The breaker point setting sets the internal timing. As the cam follower and breaker point contacts wear, the amount and when the points open changes, which changes the internal timing. When does battery current flow through the primary circuit of a battery ignition coil? When the breaker points are closed and the ignition switch is on. If an aircraft ignition switch is turned off and the engine continues to run normally, the trouble is probably caused by an open ground lead in the magneto. When a magneto is disassembled, keepers are usually placed across the poles of the rotating magnet to reduce the loss of magnetism. These keepers are usually made of soft iron. What will be the result of increasing the gap of a breaker points in the magneto? Advance the spark and decrease its intensity. If the gap of the breaker points is increased, the cam follower will contact the cam lobe sooner, advancing the spark. The reduction in intensity is because the internal timing of the magneto will be changed from the E-gap position. How are most radial engine spark plug wires connected to the distributor block? By use of cable piercing screws. The The E-gap angle is usually defined as the number of degrees between the neutral position of the rotating magnet and the position of where the contact point opens. E-gap, or efficiency gap, is a few degrees beyond the neutral position where the flux change is the greatest and the primary current flow is the greatest. This is when the points are opened and the current stops flowing. The magnetic flux collapse, inducing current in the secondary winding. Magneto breaker point opening relative to the position of the rotating magnet and distributor rotor internal timing can be set most accurately during assembly of the magneto before installation on the engine. When will the voltage in the secondary winding of a magneto installed on a normally operating engine be at the highest value? Just prior to spark plug firing. Spark plugs are considered worn out when the electrodes have worn away to about 1/2 its original dimensions. The platinum and iridium ground electrodes used on fine wire spark plugs are extremely brittle and can be broken if they are improperly handled or adjusted. True. If a spark plug lead becomes grounded, the magneto will not be affected. If a spark plug lead is grounded, the high voltage spark will pass to ground. However, this will not affect the operation of the magneto. As the spark is passing to ground, the plug will not fire and a miss will be noticed in the engine. Airflow to the pneumatic starter from the ground unit is normally prevented from causing starter overspeed during engine start by activation of a flyweight cutout switch. If the ground power unit supplies enough air to the air starter to cause an overspeed, a centrifugal cutout will be de-energized, the butterfly valve returning to its closed position. In this position, no air will pass through the starter. In the event a pneumatic start valve will not operate and the manual override must be used, the starter T-handle must be closed at scheduled starter drop out because the starter will overspeed at a given N2. During a manual air start using a T-handle, if the pilot sees the N2 reach a predetermined RPM, the T-handle must be manually closed to prevent an overspeed of the starter. The greatest density of flux lines in the magnetic circuit of a rotating magnet-type magneto occurs when the magnet is in what position? A full alignment with the field shoe faces. The maximum number of flux lines in the rotating magnet circuit occurs when the magnet is fully aligned with the pole shoe faces. This is known as the full register positions. Why are high-tension ignition cables frequently routed from the distributors to the spark plugs in flexible metallic conduits? To reduce the effect of the high-frequency electromagnetic waves emitted during operation. Flexible metallic shielding or braid is placed around high-tension ignition cables to prevent the electromagnetic field that rotates from the conductor at spark from causing radio interference. This electromagnetic field is picked up by the shielding and carried to ground. When timing a magneto internally, the alignment of the timing marks indicates that the magnets are in the E-gap position. When internally timing a magneto, E-gap occurs when the internal timing marks are aligned. E-gap position is a few degrees of the magnet rotated beyond its natural position in the direction of rotation. When internally timing a magneto, the breaker points begin to open when the rotating magnet is a few degrees past the natural position. The breaker points begin to open in a magneto when the magnet is in the E-gap position or a few degrees past neutral position in the direction of rotation. Magneto timing drift is caused by erosion of the breaker points and wear of the cam followers. What is the location of a primary capacitor in a high-tension magneto, in parallel with the breaker points. In a high-tension magneto, the primary capacitor is in parallel with the breaker points, the ignition switch, and the primary coil. Magneto pole shoes are generally made of laminations of high-grade soft iron. Due to its high permeability and low residual magnetism, laminations of soft iron are normally used for pole shoes. What components make up the magnetic system of a magneto? Rotating magnet, the pole shoes, the pole shoe extensions, and the coil core. When internally timing a magneto, the breaker points begin to open when the magnet poles are a few degrees beyond the natural position. A magneto ignition switch is connected parallel to the breaker points. The aircraft ignition switch is connected in parallel with the magneto breaker points, so the primary current flows to ground and is not interrupted by breaker points. Shielding is used on spark plugs and ignition wires to prevent interference with radio reception. Failure of engine to cease firing after turning the magneto switches off is an indication of an open P lead to ground. The magneto switch turns the magneto off by grounding the P lead that is connected to the magneto. Failure to the engine to stop running when the magneto switch is turned to off indicates an open in P lead between the magneto and the switch. Alignment of the marks provided for internal timing of the magneto indicates that the magneto is in E-gap position. When internally timing the magneto, E-gap occurs when the internal timing marks are aligned. E-gap position is a few degrees of magnet rotation beyond its natural position in the direction of rotation. What is the difference between a slow tension and a high tension engine ignition system? A low tension system uses a transformer coil near the spark plugs to boost voltage, while the high tension system voltage is constant from the magneto to the spark plugs. What test instrument could be used to test an ignition harness for suspected leakage? A high-tension lead tester. A high-tension lead tester tests leads for electrical leakage. Magneto breaker points must be timed to open when the greatest magnetic field stress exists in the magnetic circuit. Magneto breaker points are timed to open when the greatest magnetic field stress exists. Opening the points at this instance produces the highest voltage in the secondary winding. In reference to a shower of sparks ignition system, the timed opening of the retard breaker points is designed to prevent engine kickback during start. How does the ignition system of a gas turbine engine differ from that of a reciprocating engine? A high energy spark is required for ignition. Turbine engines only use ignition for starting. They are required to provide a high energy discharge, as a hot spark is needed to relight an engine that may flame out at altitude. Great caution should be exercised when handling damaged, hermetically sealed turbine engine igniter transformer units because some contain radioactive material. Caution should be exercised when handling damaged, hermetically sealed turbine engine igniter units because they might contain radioactive. Which statement is correct regarding the ignition system of turbine engines? The system is normally de-energized as soon as the engine starts. Ignition systems on most turbine engine aircraft are de-energized after starting. The term reach is applied to spark plug design and or type indicates the linear distance from the shell gasket seat to the end of the threads on the shell skirt. The number appearing on the ignition distributor block indicate the sparking order of the distributor. Numbers are located in the ignition distributor block indicating the sparking order of the distributor. These must be matched to the engine's firing order, not the cylinder number. Which of the following statements most accurately describes spark plug heat range? A cold plug is designed so that the insulator tip is reasonably short to hasten the rate of heat transfer from the tip through the spark plug shell to the cylinder head. In order to turn a magneto off, the primary circuit must be grounded. The magneto switch turns the magneto off by grounding the P lead connected to the primary circuit of the magneto. What will be the result of using too hot a spark plug? Pre-ignition. Using a spark plug that is too hot in an aircraft engine can cause a hot spot within the cylinder that can cause pre-ignition. Spark plug fouling caused by lead deposits occurs most often when cylinder head temperatures are relatively low. Lead fouling occurs when the cylinder head temperatures are too low to vaporize the lead deposits. In a 4-stroke cycle aircraft engine, when does the ignition event take place? Before the piston reaches top dead center on compression stroke. In a 4-stroke aircraft engine, ignition occurs approximately 20 degrees before top dead center on the compression stroke. When installing a magneto on an engine, the piston in the number 1 cylinder must be prescribed number of degrees before top center on the compression stroke. When installing a magneto on an aircraft engine, the number 1 cylinder must be set to a prescribed number of degrees before top dead center of the compression stroke. The number of degrees before top dead center is normally imprinted on the engine's data plate. The spark occurs at the spark plug when the ignition's primary circuit is broken. Spark occurs at the plug when the breaker points open, breaking the current flowing in the primary circuit of the magneto. The type of ignition system used on most turbine aircraft engines is capacitor discharge. Most ignition systems on turbine aircraft are the capacitance discharge high energy type system. How does high-tension ignition shielding tend to reduce radio interference? Receives and grounds high-frequency waves coming from the magneto and high-tension ignition leads. What are 2 parts of a distributor in an aircraft engine ignition system? Block and rotor. The distributor in an aircraft ignition system is made up of block and rotor. The rotor selects the wire to which the high voltage from the coil is sent, while the block serves as a terminal for the plug wires to connect to the distributor. What is the result of flashover in a distributor? Conductive carbon trail. Flashover in a distributor can cause a carbon trail to form, creating a low resistance path for the voltage to leak across. Which of the following are included in a typical turbine engine ignition system? 2 igniter plugs, 1 exciter unit, 2 high-tension igniter leads. What would be the result if a magneto breaker point mainspring did not have sufficient tension? The points will float or bounce. Ignition breaker points will float or bounce if the breaker point mainspring does not have sufficient tension. The engine could miss at high RPM settings. In the aircraft magneto system, if the P lead is disconnected, the magneto will be on regardless of ignition switch position. If the P lead becomes disconnected from the magneto will become a hot mag and will remain on regardless of the ignition switch position. Refer to figure 2-8-1. With power applied to the bus bar, what switch changes will allow the ignition exciter's test switch to function? Engine master switch and ignition switch. The ignition exciter's test switch will function when the engine master switch and the ignition switch are turned on. Refer to figure 2-8-1. If wire number 8 is broken or disconnected after starter rotation is initiated and the power lever is advanced, the starting sequence will continue normally. Refer to Figure 2-8-1, which malfunctions will allow the igniters to operate when tested but be inoperative during the start attempt. Conductor number 10 is broken, or ignition relay inoperative. Refer to Figure 2-8-1, which malfunctions will allow the igniters to operate normally during start but be inoperative when tested. Conductor number 14 broken, or conductor number 15 broken. If line 14 or 15 is broken, the test circuit on the igniters will not work. However, the igniters will work properly under a normal start cycle. Pneumatic starters are usually designed with what types of airflow impingement systems? Radial inward flow turbine and axial flow turbine. Radial inflow turbine and axial flow turbine are commonly air impingement type starting systems on pneumatic starters. What are the circuits of a magneto? The three primary circuits are the magneto circuit, the primary circuit, and secondary circuit. What are the components of the magnetic circuit? The permanent multi-pole rotating magnet, the soft iron core, and the pole shoes. When does the ignition event occur? A specified number of crankshaft degrees before top dead center on the compression stroke of each cylinder. What part of the magneto prevents arcing of the points and aids in the collapse of the magnetic field? The condenser or capacitor? What type of ignition system is used on turbine engines? Capacitor or capacitance type system? Are turbine engine ignition systems used during the entire time the engine is running? When are turbine engine ignition systems used? No. Most systems are for starting or when in-flight conditions call for flame-out protection.